a minor prince with zero economic leverage successfully halted the greatest military machine of the 15th century. How? Not with superior tactics, but by engineering a psychological weapon so terrifying it hacked the neurology of an entire empire. This is the anatomy of Gothic deterrence. History books lazily label him a monster, a bloodthirsty savage, but Geopolitics reveals a completely different profile. Vlad the Impaler was a clinical strategist operating a failed state. He realized that fear is the ultimate asymmetric capital. His cruelty was not madness, it was software. Wallachia in 1456 was entirely bankrupt, squeezed between the expanding Ottoman Crescent and the Hungarian Cross. The nation was internally bled by corrupt oligarchs known as boyars. These nobles constantly sold their loyalty to foreign bidders. The state was mathematically designed to collapse from within. Vlad needed to centralize power immediately, but he possessed no standing army to enforce the law. Therefore, he executed an administrative reset so violent that the mere thought of treason became psychologically impossible. He invited the ruling boyars to a royal feast to consolidate power. It was not a diplomatic dinner, it was a preemptive purge. He physically removed the corrupt elite from the political equation. But killing nobles wasn't enough. He needed absolute societal compliance. Therefore, he established a zero-tolerance policy where crime equated to instant public exhibition. The infamous golden cup left at the public well wasn't a symbol of a virtuous society, it was the result of calculated terror. Theft didn't stop because people became good. It stopped because the consequence was logistically suicidal. Absolute fear became the only constitution. By terraforming the domestic psychology, he secured his borders from within. But the ultimate threat was external. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror demanded an annual tribute of gold and 500 children, a standard imperial shakedown. To comply meant absolute sovereign death and total subjugation. Vlad completely refused the demand. But he didn't just send a diplomatic letter, he nailed the turbans of the Ottoman envoys directly to their skulls. This wasn't explosive anger, it was a deliberate zero-sum declaration. Therefore, he forced his own people into absolute survival. By burning the bridge of diplomacy, he ensured his population knew there was absolutely no surrender. It was victory or total extermination. In response, the Sultan mobilized 60,000 professional troops, a massive military Leviathan marching to crush a minor, insignificant rebellion in the borderlands. Wallachia's forces were outnumbered 3-1. A conventional battle meant immediate annihilation. But Vlad understood that a massive army is a massive liability if it cannot eat. Therefore, he weaponized the terrain itself, initiating a total logistical vacuum to starve the imperial machine. He aggressively burned his own crops. He poisoned his own wells. He evacuated the entire civilian population deep into the Carpathian Mountains. He handed the Ottomans a conquered territory that was entirely barren. The empire was marching blindly into an engineered biological desert. The most disciplined army on earth began to starve. Thirst and disease eroded their chain of command. But starvation is a slow process. Vlad needed to shatter their psychological spine immediately. Therefore, he launched the first modern decapitation strike in European history, the night attack. June 1462, under the cover of absolute darkness, Wallachian cavalry infiltrated the massive Ottoman camp. They were wearing stolen Ottoman uniforms. The objective was not to win a tactical battle, it was to assassinate the CEO of the empire, the Sultan himself, ending the war. The assassination attempt failed, but the psychological fallout was catastrophic. Because the attackers wore enemy colors, the Ottoman camp collapsed into severe paranoia.
In the pitch black, janissaries couldn't distinguish friend from foe. Therefore, they spent the night blindly slaughtering their own elite ranks. Vlad proved that you don't need a massive army to destroy an empire. You just need to inject extreme paranoia into their operating system. The Sultan, furious and humiliated, pushed his starving army forward to the capital of Târgoviște. He was expecting a traditional siege, but he did not find a defended city. He found an open gate, and before it stood a visual broadcast of absolute, unrestrained deterrence. 20,000 stakes, an entire forest of political prisoners and captured soldiers displayed in clinical geometric precision to break the mind. This was the ultimate framework of asymmetric war. No words, just a chilling architectural monument to the cost of invasion. The Sultan, a man who had conquered Constantinople, looked at the mathematical scale of the horror and realized a terrifying, undeniable geopolitical truth. You cannot conquer a man who operates outside the boundaries of human rationality. To rule Wallachia was to rule an active graveyard. Therefore, in a rare moment of geopolitical retreat, the great conqueror turned his invincible army around and marched back home in defeat. Vlad the Impaler saved his sovereign nation, but his strategy required him to become a monster, and monsters have no allies. The printing presses of Europe, controlled by his own economic rivals, weaponized his own deterrence strategy against him. They printed widespread pamphlets of his cruelty. They transformed a clinical geopolitical tactician into a supernatural demon. The PR campaign worked flawlessly. He was eventually imprisoned by his own allies, the ultimate historical irony. The man who mastered the geopolitics of fear was destroyed by the geopolitics of information warfare.
Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary, received European funding to fight the Ottomans, but he actively embezzled the crusade money. Therefore, he desperately needed a geopolitical scapegoat to explain his military inaction to the Pope. Vlad, already a victim of PR warfare, was the perfect alibi. The king arrested Vlad on forged charges of treason. He presented fake letters to the Vatican. But locking up a sovereign prince requires a convincing public narrative. Therefore, the Hungarian court officially endorsed the German horror pamphlets, weaponizing the myth of the bloodthirsty vampire to justify illegal imprisonment. Vlad was thrown into a high-security Hungarian prison, 12 years of absolute, isolating confinement. Most men would lose their sanity in the dark, but a clinical strategist does not break, he calculates. Therefore, Vlad adapted his psychological warfare to the immediate confines of a stone cell. Legends claim he captured rats and birds, impaling them on small wooden splinters inside his cell. Modern observers call this absolute madness, but geopolitics calls it maintaining operational discipline. He was actively preserving his cognitive edge, refusing to let the architecture of a cage dismantle his apex predator mindset. Time passed, the geopolitical board drastically shifted again. By 1476, the Ottoman Empire was surging back into Eastern Europe. Matthias Corvinus was rapidly losing ground, but he realized his own generals were terrified. Therefore, he needed to release the one man who terrified the Ottomans even more. Vlad was abruptly unleashed, reinstated as the Prince of Wallachia. He marched directly back into his homeland, but the country he returned to was severely fractured. The surviving boyars had allied with a rival claimant. Therefore, his final campaign was a two-front war against both imperial expansion and domestic betrayal.
The mere rumor of his return sent violent shockwaves through the Ottoman ranks. The psychological deterrence was still active after a decade. But fear is a highly volatile currency. It buys temporary obedience, not absolute loyalty. Therefore, when the battle lines were drawn in winter, his own men hesitated. He fought with a tiny vanguard of loyalists against a massive Turkish detachment. He was a brilliant tactician to the very end. But tactical brilliance cannot mathematically defeat overwhelming, coordinated betrayal. During the absolute chaos of combat, he was struck down, likely assassinated by his own treacherous ranks. His death was swift and unceremonious. His physical body was decapitated on the field. But the Sultan needed absolute, undeniable proof that the psychological nightmare was finally over. Therefore, his head was preserved in honey and sent to Constantinople, displayed on a high stake for the empire to witness. You can decapitate a warlord, you cannot decapitate a geopolitical paradigm. Vlad physically lost his kingdom, but his strategy of asymmetric terror fundamentally rewrote the rules of engagement in Eastern Europe. He proved that a micronation could hold a superpower hostage using nothing but absolute, uncompromising dread.
Today, pop culture completely reduces him to a fictional aristocrat drinking blood in a Gothic castle. We focus entirely on the fangs and the cape. But this is a comforting distraction. We prefer the supernatural myth. Therefore, we actively ignore the terrifying reality of his clinical administrative statecraft. Acknowledging the real historical Vlad means acknowledging a very dark truth about human governance. It mathematically proves that extreme brutality, when applied strategically, is highly effective. But modern society desperately wants to believe that morality always wins. Therefore, we rewrite the clinical strategist into a cartoonish monster. Look at the modern geopolitical landscape. Superpowers still aggressively use proxies. Oligarchs still betray their nations for offshore accounts. Small nations still use asymmetric deterrence, whether it is digital hacking or economic sabotage. The hardware has evolved, but the underlying software of fear remains exactly the same. Vlad the Impaler didn't use advanced technology or massive wealth. He used the architecture of the human mind. He deeply understood that the amygdala reacts faster than the prefrontal cortex. But utilizing this strategy requires a leader to sacrifice their own humanity. Therefore, he became a prisoner of his methodology. He won the temporary war for Wallachian sovereignty. He successfully delayed the Ottoman expansion into Europe for decades. But the ultimate cost was his legacy, his freedom, and his life. Therefore, his story is not a triumph. It is a chilling autopsy of the true price of absolute power. The next time you analyze a global geopolitical crisis, do not look for heroes in white armor. Look directly for the logistics. Look for the underlying financial leverage. And most importantly, look closely at who actively controls the narrative of fear. The one who dictates the terror controls the borders. We are entirely conditioned to believe that democracy and diplomacy are the default states of human nature. But historical data proves they are fragile, temporary anomalies. When the system collapses, when the state fails, the wolves return. Therefore, survival defaults to the most ruthless operator in the room. Vlad III was the immune system of a dying nation, a brutal white blood cell engineered to eradicate an infection at any cost. But an overactive immune system eventually destroys the host it tries to protect. Therefore, his reign was a necessary catastrophic fever that burned the country to save it.
This is the cold, unforgiving reality of realpolitik. No comforting myths, no moral victories, only survival and extinction. But Vlad's use of psychological terror is just one chapter in the manual of asymmetric dominance. There is a much more insidious way to completely conquer a sovereign nation. What happens when an empire realizes that economic subversion is vastly cheaper than a military invasion? How do you buy a country from the inside out? The blueprint for the ultimate corporate takeover of a sovereign state is already decoded in our next analysis. Click here to step into the boardroom of history's greatest financial cartel.
Violence is loud. It leaves massive physical scars and invites immediate retaliation. But what if you could completely conquer a sovereign state without drawing a single sword? Therefore, you must replace the military general with the central banker. Welcome to 15th century Florence, the birthplace of the modern financial cartel. Florence was officially a republic, a bastion of Renaissance liberty and democratic voting. But beneath the beautiful marble architecture, it was a ruthless financial war zone. The true power didn't lie in the Senate or the military. It lived entirely in the ledgers of the Medici Bank. Cosimo de' Medici did not wear heavy armor. He did not command loyal legions. But he understood a terrifying geopolitical truth. If you control the absolute supply of credit, you control the state. Therefore, he began systematically buying the republic from the inside out, using debt as his primary weapon. He didn't bribe politicians directly. That is amateur corruption. Instead, he made the politicians entirely dependent on his bank for their personal and political survival. But his rivals, the Albizzi family, recognized this silent hostile takeover. Therefore, they used their political leverage to arrest Cosimo and banish him from Florence. The Albizzi thought they had saved the republic by amputating the tumor, but they completely misunderstood the mechanics of global finance. Cosimo didn't just leave, he took his massive capital reserves with him. Therefore, he initiated the first weaponized capital flight in recorded economic history. Without the Medici liquidity, the Florentine economy instantly flatlined. Trade halted. The government faced immediate bankruptcy. The citizens panicked. But Cosimo patiently waited in Venice, watching his enemy's political capital burn. Therefore, within exactly 1 year, the desperate republic officially begged him to return and save them. He returned not just as a mere citizen, but as an absolute sovereign creditor. He had mathematically proven that the state could not survive without his money. But Cosimo remembered the fate of Julius Caesar. Open dictators are assassinated. Therefore, he engineered the ultimate geopolitical camouflage, the invisible dictatorship. He refused to take absolute public office. He remained a private citizen, tending to his bank. But he secretly controlled the acquipiatori, the electoral committee that determined which names went into the voting bags. Therefore, every democratically elected official was actually a pre-approved financially compromised Medici asset. The citizens celebrated their free elections. The illusion of democracy was perfectly maintained. The gap theory in pure action. But the ultimate prize was not just controlling Florence, it was controlling God. Therefore, the Medici systematically positioned themselves as the exclusive central bankers to the Vatican. They financed the papacy. They collected church taxes from across Europe. Excommunication is a terrifying spiritual weapon, but the Medici weaponized it for debt collection. If a kingdom refused to pay the bank, the Pope threatened their eternal soul. Therefore, faith was converted directly into a logistical enforcement arm. With the Pope's spiritual backing and Florence's economic engine, the Medici created an international intelligence network disguised as bank branches. London, Geneva, Avignon. But money cannot move safely in a war zone. Therefore, they engineered the balance of power doctrine to mathematically stabilize the Italian peninsula. If Milan grew too strong, the Medici secretly funded Venice.
If Venice advanced, they cut their credit and funded Milan. They funded both sides of every major conflict, but they never allowed either side to win a decisive victory. Therefore, perpetual stalemate ensured continuous borrowing. Peace was incredibly profitable. War was even more profitable as long as the bank controlled the outcome. They reduced geopolitical warfare to a predictable mathematical algorithm, but the old aristocratic families deeply hated the new financial cartel. Therefore, the Pazzi family plotted a violent, desperate decapitation strike. Easter Sunday, 1478, inside the massive Florence Cathedral, during the holiest moment of the Mass, the Pazzi assassins drew their hidden daggers. They brutally murdered Giuliano de' Medici. But his brother, Lorenzo the Magnificent, fought his way into the sacristy and survived. The decapitation strike had failed. The assassins rushed into the city square expecting the citizens to rise up and celebrate the death of the banking cartel, just like the liberators of Julius Caesar. But they miscalculated the exact same variable. The citizens loved the cartel. Therefore, the mob turned violently against the liberators. Lorenzo didn't wait for legal trials. He didn't use the courts. He utilized public terror exactly like Vlad the Impaler, but he did it with Renaissance flair. Therefore, within hours, the Archbishop of Pisa, a key conspirator, was hanging by his neck from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. This was the ultimate geopolitical broadcast. You can challenge a military, you can challenge a state, but if you physically attack the cartel will suspend all laws of God and man to liquidate you. Therefore, Lorenzo consolidated absolute power, transforming Florence from a hidden oligarchy into a functional monarchy. The Medici survived because they understood the anatomy of modern power better than anyone else. They proved that the man who issues the debt dictates the reality. But history is a ruthless auditor. No financial empire lasts forever. Debt is an illusion. Therefore, reality eventually comes to collect. We are taught to admire the Renaissance for its beautiful art and enlightened philosophy. We marvel at Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, but we conveniently forget who paid for the paint. Therefore, the beautiful art was simply a PR campaign to distract from the brutal mechanics of asymmetric financial warfare. The Medici playbook didn't die with them, it was simply upgraded. Look at the modern world. Who truly commands the political landscape? The elected officials or the megabanks and tech monopolies that fund them? The republic is a theater. The cartel is immortal.
By 1513, the Medici Cartel achieved the ultimate geopolitical victory. Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X. He now controlled both the absolute financial ledgers of Europe and the spiritual gates of heaven. But maintaining a global monopoly is incredibly expensive. Rome was technically bankrupt. Pope Leo wanted to build St. Peter's Basilica, the greatest architectural PR project in history. Therefore, he engineered a brilliant, ruthless financial instrument, the indulgence. He monetized human guilt. You could literally purchase a piece of paper that erased your sins, the ultimate spiritual tax. The system was highly efficient. Massive capital aggressively flowed from the working classes of Germany directly into the Medici bank accounts in Rome. But an obscure German monk named Martin Luther looked at the system and saw exactly what it was: a catastrophic sovereign capital drain. Luther wasn't just a theologian, he was a geopolitical disruptor. He understood that the Vatican's power relied entirely on their monopoly of the source code, the Latin Bible. Therefore, in 1517, he wrote the 95 Theses, an academic declaration of war against the financial extraction of Germany.
Pinning a document to a door in a small town usually achieves nothing. It is a localized protest. But Luther understood the power of asymmetric technology. Therefore, he utilized the recently invented printing press. He translated his complex academic arguments into aggressive, highly readable German pamphlets. The printing press was the Internet of the 16th century. Luther bypassed the traditional gatekeepers. His pamphlets went completely viral across Europe in weeks. He successfully executed the first massive, decentralized information warfare campaign in human history. The cartel lost control of the narrative. The Vatican reacted with standard imperial force. They issued a papal bull threatening Luther with absolute excommunication, spiritual death. But Luther knew that to defeat a cartel, you must publicly humiliate their symbols of power. Therefore, he openly burned the Pope's decree in the streets. This was an unprecedented decapitation of psychological authority. Pope Leo X demanded that the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, physically execute the monk. But Charles V was fighting wars against France and the Ottomans. Therefore, he needed the political support of the independent German princes. 1521, the Diet of Worms. Luther stood alone before the emperor and the combined military-financial might of Europe. He was ordered to recant. He completely refused. But he was just a monk with zero military capacity. How did he survive the inevitable assassination order? He survived because geopolitics is driven by interests, not theology. The German princes, led by Frederick the Wise, saw an incredible geopolitical opportunity. If they broke from the Vatican, they could stop paying taxes to Rome. Therefore, they orchestrated a fake kidnapping to protect Luther.
Luther was hidden safely inside the Wartburg Castle. The Reformation was never just a religious awakening. It was a massive, coordinated tax revolt by the German oligarchy, disguised as a spiritual movement. But Luther needed to secure this independence permanently. Therefore, he executed his masterstroke. He translated the entire New Testament from Greek directly into common German. He open-sourced the operating system of the empire. The priests lost their absolute monopoly on interpreting reality. Information was completely decentralized. The psychological cage of the Medici Cartel was shattered. Information liberation is a weapon of mass destruction. The peasants, reading the Bible for themselves, realized the hierarchy was a human invention. But when the peasants violently revolted against the princes in 1524, Luther faced a brutal geopolitical choice: support the poor or support his protectors. He chose logistics over morality. Luther viciously condemned the peasants, urging the princes to slaughter the rebels. Over 100,000 peasants were exterminated. Because a clinical strategist knows you cannot wage a war against a global cartel without the absolute backing of the local military-industrial complex. Luther was not a saint. He was a ruthless operator who successfully utilized asymmetric information warfare to break a superpower. But when you destroy the foundational algorithm of an entire continent, you create a massive geopolitical vacuum. Therefore, Europe plunged into a century of absolute, unmitigated slaughter. The 30 Years' War. Millions died. Entire nations were burned to ash over the interpretation of translated text. It mathematically proves that liberating information does not immediately bring peace. It brings extreme polarization. It brings total war. The Medici Cartel was broken, but the cost was apocalyptic.
We look at the internet today and celebrate the democratization of information. We believe social media frees us from corporate gatekeepers, but we fail to study the geopolitical aftermath of the printing press. Therefore, we are completely blind to the fact that decentralized data accelerates societal fragmentation. When everyone holds their own version of the absolute truth, compromise becomes mathematically impossible. The algorithms of today are simply digital printing presses, perfectly designed to monetize our outrage and tribalism. We are not entering a new age of enlightenment. We are entering a new 30 years war of digital information. The combatants are not kings and popes. They are massive tech monopolies and sovereign intelligence agencies. And just like in 1648, this absolute chaos can only end when a completely new geopolitical framework is violently forced upon the survivors. How did Europe survive its own apocalypse? They had to invent a completely new concept, the modern nation-state. The idea that a government has absolute sovereignty over its own territory, free from the cartel. The blueprint for the modern world was forged in the bloodiest treaty in human history.
The 30 Years' War was not a theological dispute. It was a geopolitical meat grinder. But the devastation was so absolute that mercenary armies physically ran out of food. Therefore, they began cannibalizing the very populations and economies they were hired to protect. Over 8 million people were exterminated. Entire regions of Europe were depopulated. The surviving warlords looked at the ashes and realized a terrifying mathematical truth. But it wasn't a moral awakening. Therefore, it was the clinical realization that if the war continued, there would be absolutely no tax base left to rule. They desperately needed to stop fighting over the source code of the soul. But no one trusted the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor to mediate anymore. The Medici Cartel's spiritual authority was entirely liquidated. Therefore, they had to invent a completely secular operating system for global politics. A system based on physical, defensible borders, not spiritual submission. 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. This was the exact historical moment the modern world was hacked into existence. The warlords signed a treaty that fundamentally rewired the geopolitical DNA of human civilization. They established the absolute principle of state sovereignty. What happens inside your borders is your exclusive business. But this unprecedented stability required a massive, terrifying trade-off from the civilian population. Therefore, the citizens had to permanently surrender their fundamental right to wage private war. They handed the ultimate monopoly on violence directly to the newly formed nation-state. The Leviathan was born. A bureaucratic, mechanized, heavily armed monster that promises to protect you from foreign wolves, but it demands absolute taxation, conscription, and total compliance in return. The Pope literally condemned the Westphalian Treaty as null, void, invalid, and empty of meaning for all time, but his words were utterly powerless. Therefore, the new secular kings completely ignored him. The era of the religious cartel was officially dead. The era of the state cartel had begun. Look closely at the invisible geopolitical architecture you live inside today. Passports, regulated borders, standing armies, central banks, executive orders. These are not natural human conditions. They are highly engineered, artificial survival mechanisms, forged in the fires of 17th century slaughter. We traded the terrifying chaos of the medieval world for the suffocating, predictable order of the Leviathan. But the Westphalian system is currently cracking under the immense pressure of the digital age. Therefore, the 400-year-old operating system is failing in real time.
Multinational tech monopolies and decentralized algorithms are effortlessly bypassing sovereign borders, exactly like the Medici banks and Luther's printing presses did centuries ago. The nation-state is desperately trying to maintain its absolute monopoly on narrative and violence, but it is fighting a losing war against invisible data.
Therefore, we are rapidly returning to a neo-medieval era, a ruthless world of corporate cartels, private military contractors, and extreme psychological deterrence. The actors have updated their wardrobes, the hardware is digital, but the underlying mathematical equations of power remain exactly the same. Vlad the Impaler taught us the brutal, clinical mechanics of asymmetric fear. He proved that terror is a logistical weapon. The Medici Cartel taught us the invisible, suffocating chains of sovereign debt. They proved that the creditor is the true king. Martin Luther taught us the catastrophic, polarizing power of decentralized information. He proved that liberating data can burn down a continent. And Westphalia taught us the desperate, tragic human need for order, even if that order requires submitting to a Leviathan. You have been watching Lesson of History. We do not sell comforting bedtime stories about the inevitable triumph of democracy. We do not deal in hope. We actively autopsy the raw, unforgiving anatomy of human power. We decode the DNA of empires. If you want to successfully navigate the coming geopolitical winter, you must fundamentally understand the algorithms of the past. But understanding requires discarding your most cherished illusions about how the world actually works. Therefore, you must learn to see the matrix of power. Stay dangerous, stay ruthlessly skeptical. Never blindly trust the manufactured narrative of the victor, the banker, or the state. Follow the logistics, follow the supply lines, follow the debt. Because the cartel never truly dies. It never surrenders. It only changes its name, upgrades its technology, and rewrites the laws to protect its profit margins. The Game of Thrones is not fiction. It is the permanent, relentless reality of our species. The board is set. The pieces are moving. And you are either a player or you are the board. This is the final lesson.